Today, I wanted to talk about the hidden psychology behind old school RuneScape updates. Old school RuneScape updates are a balancing act, not just in terms of game mechanics. Every new piece of content has to walk a tightrope between being worth doing and not so good that it breaks the game. If the rewards are too weak, players skip it, but if they're too strong, suddenly everyone's forced to do it, and that creates its own kind of chaos. That pressure is unique to old school RuneScape because the community has a vote. Jagex isn't just designing content. They're pitching it to a highly engaged, hyper-analytical player base that has both nostalgia and spreadsheets guiding their decisions. And that makes the psychology of each update even more important. Because the moment it doesn't feel right, the pitch fails, or worse, passes and becomes a PR nightmare. Once an update is in the game, it's subject to real-time scrutiny. Players will test it, break it, theory craft it, and complain about it within hours. Updates aren't just content drops, they're also social experiments, and each one challenges Jagex to satisfy a community that wants change, but not too much, wants new rewards, but not necessarily new metas, and ultimately, a better game that still feels nostalgic to one they fell in love with 18 years ago. Old school RuneScape isn't just another MMO. It's a game born from nostalgia and resurrected by democracy. When Jagex launched Old School RuneScape in 2013, it was essentially a time capsule, a backup of 2007 RuneScape that players could return to after years of controversial changes in RuneScape 3, namely the evolution of combat. But what made it revolutionary wasn't just the rollback, it was the introduction of player polls. Every major update would be voted on by the community, and only those with 75%, now 70%, approval rating would pass. This system gave players a sense of ownership unlike anything in the industry. They weren't just consumers, they were gatekeepers. If something felt too modern, too overpowered, or too far removed from the old school spirit, it could be vetoed by the player base. The psychology of this is powerful. By giving players a vote, Jagex gave them buy-in. Updates weren't something done to them, they were something done with them. And that created a fiercely loyal, hyper-invested community that felt personally responsible for the game's direction. But there's a cost to that power. When every update needs to be both fun and pollable, it forces Jagex into a tight creative box. They can't just innovate, they have to sell it first. And players don't always vote with game health in mind. They vote with bias, nostalgia, personal gain, and all the psychology we're about to explore. The polling system gave old school RuneScape its second life, but it also guaranteed that every update would be a battle between what's good for the game and what the players think is good for them. For any update to succeed, it has to offer value, either through XP, GP, new best in slot gear, or just cool new stuff to do. This taps into what's called the effort justification effect, part of cognitive dissonance theory. Basically, if you grind something hard, your brain wants it to feel worth it. So if new content isn't rewarding enough, your brain flags it as a waste of time. In old school RuneScape, where many players have already put in thousands of hours, this effect is amplified. Any update that doesn't clearly communicate this is time well spent gets dismissed as filler. Think of it like opening a clue scroll reward and seeing a steel plate body. It's not just underwhelming, it actively insults the time you put in. Good content avoids that by giving players dopamine, even if it's in the form of slight progress, cool cosmetics, or high-risk, high-reward mechanics. But the value isn't always objective. It's psychological. Even if a boss doesn't pay out millions per hour, if it feels satisfying, feels challenging, or rewarding to kill, players will do it. This is how the flow state comes into play. That perfect balance between challenge and skill. Updates that generate flow keep players hooked. They don't just log in for rewards, they log in for the experience. Think of skillers that enjoy 3-tick granite mining or 3-tick barbarian fishing. That's also what turns a boss fight into content and content into ritual. But here's the flip side. If new content is too rewarding, it causes what designers call update cannibalization, where one piece of content makes everything else irrelevant. The boss that drops 10 mil an hour, everyone flocks to it. The skilling method that's 30% faster XP becomes mandatory. This is how we end up with content that burns hot and dies fast. Take a look at Phantom Muspa's early release or the original launch of the Osmumten's Fang with TOA. The numbers were too good, so the community hyper-optimized, took advantage of the release, then quickly got bored or angry when the inevitable nerfs came. That roller coaster isn't just gameplay imbalance. It's a cycle of psychological whiplash. And when players feel like Jagex is baiting them into grinds just to pull the rug later, trust erodes fast. That erosion matters, because it undermines the long-term health of the game. If players believe every new piece of content isn't either broken or dead on arrival, it creates learned helplessness. That a feeling that engaging with updates is pointless because balance is temporary. This directly fights against the reward-seeking behavior we just talked about. Instead of players chasing value, they start waiting for the patch notes, wondering when the nerf hammer will fall. This is where the illusion of choice kicks in. Players claim they want variety, different ways to train, fight, and earn. But in practice, they usually default to the most efficient path. And if there is a best method, that becomes the only method. This connects directly to a concept known as rational choice theory. The idea that given all the options, players will almost always choose the one that gives them the best return. But in a game like old school RuneScape, where efficiency culture is king, rational choice turns into tunnel vision. Suddenly, you're not picking your favorite boss, you're picking the one that gives you the most GP per hour. Even when side content is fun or visually stunning, it dies if it doesn't fit the spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet-driven culture feeds directly back into Jagex's update strategy. If one method clearly outshines others, it creates a dominant strategy. And dominant strategies kill variety. This is the paradox. To preserve choice, you have to avoid giving players a clear best option. It's a trap we'll see again in power creep, but it starts here, with players choosing efficiency, then blaming the devs when variety disappears. Of course, you have a handful of players that will make it a point to kill 200,000 men in Lumbridge before continuing through the game, or locking themselves into self-imposed challenges, specifically to avoid the idea of rational choice theory or dominant strategy. And while watching players share accomplishments of self-imposed challenges is enjoyable, it is a very small minority of the player base at large. To avoid this problem, Jagex often leans on a philosophy of side grades, not upgrades. Instead of dropping strictly better items, they give us gear that's situational. Strong in certain cases, but not always the answer. This strategy plays into the psychological principle of perceived autonomy, a core part of self-determination theory. When players feel they're making meaningful decisions, like choosing gear based on style or situation, they feel more in control and more invested. That's why people still use something like the Dragon Hunter Lance or Inquisitor armor over newer, flashier alternatives. The content is viable without being mandatory, so it feels like a choice, not an obligation. But side grades only work if the community trusts that they'll remain viable. When updates introduce situational gear that later gets nerfed or forgotten, players feel burned. The whole system depends on long-term ecosystem balance, each item keeping its niche without being power crept out of existence. In a game where even Iron Men memorize drop tables, situational can't mean worthless in 6 months, it has to mean strategic. Now let's talk about community contradictions. One of the wildest psychological patterns in old school RuneScape is how players react to nerfs. You'll hear something like, "Don't nerf this, it's been out for years. It's too late." But then 2 days after a new boss drop, you'll hear something like, "Wait, you nerfed it already? I didn't even get to abuse it yet. I didn't even get to grind it yet." This isn't just hypocrisy, it's loss aversion mixed with temporal bias. People hate losing an advantage they already had more than missing out on something they never got to touch. So when something you've invested in, like a weapon, skill method, or gear grind, gets nerfed, it feels like your time was wasted. But if you were planning to abuse something and didn't get the chance, that also feels unfair. The common thread isn't logic, it's entitlement. Players feel owed an advantage, whether it's past, present, or future. And this bias is only triggered when an update removes power. Nobody complains when a new method gets buffed, even if it warps the meta, because gains are perceived as natural, while losses feel like betrayal. This plays back into the earlier discussion of update fatigue. The same players who demand variety also demand protection from any change that makes their current strategy worse. It's a loop, and one that Jagex has to break without breaking the trust of the player base. This cycle leads us to the real long-term threat, power creep. Every update that raises the ceiling just a little bit, a better prayer, stronger gear, more efficient skilling, devalues everything before it. Power creep happens naturally to some degree, but it also causes a real long-term threat. This undermines one of old school RuneScape's biggest psychological strengths, permanence. The idea that progress made in 2016 still matters today is what separates it from most MMOs. But once new gear starts permanently outclassing the old, you lose that historical continuity. Players stop feeling like they're building a legacy and start feeling like they're chasing a meta that moves faster than their free time can keep up with. You'll also sometimes see this old gear get interwoven into the new gear, like Bandos into Torva. And it all loops back to player trust. A game where every update overwrites the last isn't a game you build memories in, it's more of a treadmill. And old school RuneScape was never meant to be a treadmill, it was meant to be a world. Power creep turns that world into a race, and not everyone wants to sprint. Introducing more and more powerful weapons and skilling methods isn't bad, but it has to be done correctly, or this game of keeping up with new updates will burn players out over time, and that permanence they once felt was present will no longer stand true. So what makes a good old school RuneScape update? It's not just about content, it's about psychology. The best updates offer real value, but don't become mandatory. They reward your time without erasing your past effort. They add to the game's toolbox, but they don't replace it. Jagex's best updates respect the player's autonomy, the game's identity, and the invisible social contract between effort and reward. When that balance is hit, players don't just engage with the content, they rally around it. They talk about it for years, and that's the true hallmark of success in a game that lives or dies by its community's emotional memory. And maybe most importantly, the best updates feel fair, not just balanced, but psychologically fair. Fair to the people that grind, fair to the casuals, fair to the players who are 7,000 hours deep, and fair to the players who just unlocked Barrow's gloves. When fairness is preserved, even if an update isn't perfect, the community can live with it, because what they really want isn't just new content, it's a game that respects their time. So next time an update drops and the forums or Reddit are on fire, ask yourself, are players really upset because the game is unbalanced, or are they upset because their advantage is at risk? Because in the end, that's what so many update reactions boil down to. Not always balance, but personal loss. Not fairness, but fear. Fear that the time you spent was wasted. That your grind is no longer optimal. That someone else got a head start. But recognizing that fear and seeing the psychology behind it is the first step towards actually understanding what makes an update good, or a total flame war waiting to happen. And the irony, the stronger the reaction, the more you know that the update matters, because apathy is worse than outrage. When people stop caring, the game's in trouble. But as long as the arguments are loud, emotional, and absurdly specific, old school RuneScape is alive and well.